The silent mechanic Kale Voss had not spoken a single word in 12 years. The other species on Nexus Station believed he was broken somehow, a defective human that had been thrown away to work in the lowest parts of the station where nobody wanted. To go the Velith were insect-like creatures with clicking mandibles, and they would make sounds of pity whenever they walked past him in the corridors. The Dracori were massive reptilian beings with scales like armor, and they loved to make jokes about the silent ape who could only communicate with hand movements and nods of his head. Even the station computer had marked him in its records as a human with communication problems, but Kale heard everything. He heard every secret deal whispered. In dark corridors, he heard every classified message that leaked through the old walls of the station. He heard every secret that the powerful beings of the galaxy thought was safe from ears like his. Kale worked alone in Salvage Bay 7, a massive room filled with the broken bodies of warships and the remains of dead civilizations that had fallen. Long ago, his hands moved with perfect skill as he took apart technology that alien engineers had declared impossible to fix within just a few weeks of his arrival at the station. The output of Salvage Bay 7 had grown 3 times larger than before within a few months. Parts and components that should have been worthless scrap were selling for premium prices across the galactic market. Station was run by an overseer named Council Morix, a Kethri who looked like a bloated slug with too many eyes and a mouth that never stopped eating. Morix noticed the increased profits coming from Salvage Bay 7, but he never bothered to investigate where they came from. Why would he waste his time on such matters when the answer was obvious to him? Kale was just a human after all. Humanity had only been traveling among the stars for about 300 years. They were tolerated by the older species, but never respected. The galaxy had seen 1,000 young species rise up with hope and dreams, only to fade away into nothing. Humans would surely be the same. What Counselor Morix did not know was that Kale spent his nights doing something very different from sleeping. Deep in the forgotten maintenance tunnels of the station, there was a hidden workshop that Kale had carved out with his own hands over many years. The best that tunnels had been abandoned for centuries, and nobody remembered they existed except for Kale, who had found them by accident. During his first year on the station, inside this secret place he had built workbenches covered with strange equipment. He had filled the walls with salvaged alien technology from dozens of different species. Some of the technology was so old, the species who made it had been dead for thousands of years. Every night after his shift ended, Kale would slip away from his small sleeping quarters and make his way through the dark passages to his workshop. There he would work for hours, putting together pieces of technology that should not fit together. He would study ancient data crystals that he had recovered from wrecked ships. He would read the scientific theories of civilizations that had been conquered and forgotten. The older species of the galaxy had grown lazy in their thinking. They believed they had discovered everything important long ago. They looked at their technology and their power, and they decided that nothing new could ever surprise them. But Kale saw things differently. When he looked at the broken machines and abandoned research of dead civilizations, he did not see garbage. He saw puzzle pieces, saw connections that the ancient species had missed because they were too proud to look. Humans were young, and that meant humans still knew how to wonder. Humans still knew how to ask the question that older species had forgotten how to ask: what if we are wrong about everything? Kale had been asking that question for 12 years, and slowly, piece by piece, he had been building an answer. The other workers on the station thought he was simple-minded because he never spoke. They thought his silence meant he had nothing to say. They could not have been more wrong. Kale was silent because he was listening, was silent because he was learning. He was silent because he understood something very important about the galaxy and the creatures who lived it. The ones who talk the most often know the least. The ones who boast about their power are often the most afraid, and the ones who are dismissed and ignored are often the most dangerous civil in his workshop. Kale kept his greatest project hidden beneath a panel in the floor. It was a device no larger than his closed fist. It looked simple from the outside. Just a sphere of dull gray metal covered in geometric patterns that seemed to move and shift when you tried to look at them directly. Called it the Paradox Engine. He had built it from pieces of 17 different civilizations. Some of those civilizations were older than the current masters of the galaxy. Some of them had been destroyed by the very empires that now ruled the stars. The Paradox Engine was not a weapon in the normal sense. It did not fire beams of energy or launch missiles or create explosions. Instead, it did something far more terrifying. It changed the rules. Every species in the galaxy believed they understood how the universe worked. They had laws of physics written in books that were older than human civilization. They had certainties that they never questioned. The Paradox Engine made those certainties meaningless according to every known law of physics. The device in Kale's workshop could not exist. The math said it was impossible. The science said it was a fantasy, but Kale had found gaps. In the math, he had discovered errors in the science. He had realized that the ancient species had made assumptions long ago, but nobody ever bothered to check, and in those unchecked assumptions, he had found room to build something new, something that would change everything. For 12 years, Kale had been patient. He had been silent, had been invisible. He had let the galaxy ignore him and mock him and treat him like he was nothing. But he had never been nothing. He had been waiting, and now after 12 long years, his wait was almost over. The Paradox Engine was nearly complete. Soon, the galaxy would learn what a single silent human could do when given enough time and enough motivation. Soon, the ancient empires would discover that they had made a terrible mistake when they dismissed humanity as primitive and unimportant. Soon, everything would change. Kale finished his work for the night and carefully replaced the floor panel over his hidden creation. He made his way back through the dark tunnels to his sleeping quarters. Tomorrow he would go back to Salvage Bay 7 and work in silence, while the aliens around him continued to believe he was broken and simple. But that was fine. Let them believe what they wanted. Truth would reveal itself when the time was right, and when that time came, the galaxy would never be the same again. The hegemony arrives. The Vrin hegemony came without any warning at all. One moment, the space around Nexus Station was empty and peaceful. The next moment, 300 warships appeared out of nowhere, their black hulls swallowing the light of nearby stars like hungry mouths. The Vrin were conquerors. They were an ancient species that had been crushing civilizations for longer than most records could remember. The last 1,000 years alone, they had destroyed 12 different peoples completely. They did not come to make deals. They did not come to trade goods. They simply arrived at a world and demanded total surrender. Anyone foolish enough to refuse was destroyed so completely that nothing remained. The alarm systems of Nexus Station screamed to life as the massive fleet took position around the station counselor. Morix nearly choked on his food when the reports came flooding into his office. 300 Vrin warships, any single one of them, could reduce the station to dust in moments. Entire fleet together had enough firepower to crack planets in half within 1 hour of the fleet's arrival. Counselor Morix was on his knees before the Vrin delegation that had transported onto the station. The Vrin High Commander was terrifying to look at. He stood nearly 3 meters tall, and his body was covered in living armor that moved and writhed like smoke that had been trapped in solid form. His eyes burned with cold intelligence and absolute confidence in his own power. Behind him stood a dozen Vrin soldiers, each one carrying weapons that hummed with barely contained energy. The other members of the station council arrived quickly, and they all did the same thing as Morix. They got on their knees and lowered their heads. The Velith delegate offered her People's Hive daughters as servants for the Vrin Empire. The Jokori delegate offered entire planets, rich with minerals and precious metals. The Kethri delegates, including Morix, offered the labor of billions of their people, Each species scrambled to give away whatever they had in exchange for their lives. The Vrin High Commander listened to all of their offers with obvious boredom on his face. He had heard such desperate pleas 1,000 times before. They meant nothing to him. When the delegates had finished making their offers, the High Commander finally spoke. His voice was deep and cold, like the sound of a glacier slowly crushing everything beneath it. The station would serve as a forward base for the hegemony's expansion into this region of space. All beings on the station who were not Vrin would be processed to determine their usefulness. Those who were deemed useful would be allowed to live as servants. Those who were deemed not useful would be recycled for their biological resources. The alien council members began to weep. Some of them begged even harder, offering more and more of their people and their worlds. Some of them tried to bargain, asking for small mercies that the Vrin had no intention of granting. None of it mattered to the High Commander. He had already decided what would happen, and nothing these lesser beings said would change his mind. Far below the council chamber, in the depths of Salvage Bay 7, Kale Voss heard the alarms like everyone else on the station. He stopped his work and listened to the announcements that came over the communication system. The bombs, like everyone else on the station. He stopped his work and listened to the announcements that came over the communication system. The Vrin hegemony had arrived. All personnel were ordered to remain calm and await further instructions. Kale knew exactly what those instructions would be. He had heard stories about the Vrin for years. He knew what they did to species they conquered. He knew that humans would be considered barely useful as manual labor, and that most of them would be recycled. For a long moment, he stood perfectly still in the middle of his workspace. He thought about his years of silence. He thought about his hidden workshop and the device he had built there. He thought about all the aliens who had mocked him and ignored him and treated him like garbage. Part of him wanted to let them face the consequences of their arrogance. Part of him thought they deserved whatever the Vrin would do to them. But then he thought about the other humans on the station. There were not many of them. Maybe a few hundred scattered across various jobs. They were janitors and cargo handlers and mechanics like himself. They were ordinary people who had done nothing wrong except be born into a species that the galaxy did not respect. They would all die if he did nothing. And beyond this station, there was Earth and all the human colonies spread across a small corner of the galaxy. Vrin would come for them eventually too. They would process billions of humans for usefulness. They would recycle those who did not meet their standard. Scale thought about children he had never met. Human children living on worlds he had never visited. He thought about them being taken by the Vrin and processed like raw materials. He took a deep breath and made his decision. He walked to the hidden panel in the floor and removed it carefully. Paradox engine sat in its hiding place. Dull gray metal covered in patterns that seemed to shift and dance. He picked it up and held it in his hand. It felt warm, almost alive. For 12 years he had built this device in secret. For 12 years he had planned to use it only as a last resort. Only if humanity faced complete destruction. That moment had arrived sooner than he expected. He tucked the device into his jacket pocket and left Salvage Bay 7. He walked through corridors filled with panicking aliens who ran in every direction. Without purpose, none of them paid any attention to the quiet human mechanic walking calmly among them. Even now, in the face of doom, they still could not see him as anything important. Kale made his way toward the council chamber. He moved without hurry, his footsteps steady and sure. He had waited 12 years for this moment. He had been silent for 12 years, preparing for this moment. Now, it was time to speak. Now it was time to show the galaxy what humanity could really do. The Vrin High Commander was still lecturing the groveling council members when Kale reached the great doors of the chamber. 2 Vrin guards stood at the entrance, their weapons ready. They looked down at the small human approaching them with confusion in their burning eyes. No, One had been foolish enough to approach the council chamber since the Vryn arrived. What? Did this tiny creature think it was doing Kale? Did not slow down. He did not hesitate. He walked straight toward the doors, as if the guards were not even there. One of the guards raised his weapon, but something in the human's eyes made him pause. There was no fear in those eyes. There was no desperation. There was only calm certainty. The look of someone who knew exactly what was about to happen. The guard hesitated, just long enough for Kale to reach the doors. He pushed them open and stepped into the council chamber. Every eye in the room turned to look at him. The weeping delegates stopped their tears. The Vryn soldiers raised their weapons. The High Commander turned his cold gaze upon the small human who had dared to interrupt. Kale reached into his pocket and wrapped his fingers around the paradox engine. The time for silence was over. The impossible weapon. Every being in the council chamber stared at Kale as he walked through the great doors. Alien delegates who had been crying on their knees looked up with confusion on their faces. Who was this human, and why was he interrupting? The end of their civilization, Councilor Morix recognized the silent mechanic from Salvage Bay 7, and his many eyes went wide with disbelief. What was this broken creature doing here of all places? The Vryn High Commander studied the small human with cold amusement rippling across his face. His living armor shifted and moved as if it was laughing at the absurdity of the situation. A single human daring to walk into this chamber as if he had any power at all. The commander raised one armored hand and gestured toward his guards. Remove this creature, he ordered in his glacier-cold voice. 3 Vryn soldiers immediately moved forward, their weapons ready to grab the human and drag him away. Kale watched them approach with absolutely no fear in his eyes. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the paradox engine. A small gray sphere sat in his palm, its geometric patterns shifting and moving in ways that should not have been possible to. The alien eyes watching it looked like nothing special, just a ball of dull metal. The Vryn soldiers were almost upon him when Kale activated the device. What happened next would be discussed and debated by scientists for hundreds of years to come. The sphere unfolded. There was no other word that could describe what it did. It opened up like a flower blooming, but in directions that did not exist in normal. Space reality itself seemed to bend and twist around the device. The 3 Vryn guards who had been rushing toward Kale simply stopped existing in that place and time. One moment they were there, solid and real and dangerous. The next moment they were gone, scattered across 1,000 different moments in 1,000 different places. They were not dead, exactly. They were just no longer here. They were no longer now. The council chamber went completely silent. Every alien in the room stared at the space where the guards had been standing. The Vryn High Commander's amusement vanished from his face, like smoke blown away by a strong wind. In its place came something that Kale had seen on the faces of 100 different species over the years. Fear. The High Commander took a step backward, his living armor writhing with distress. What technology is this? He demanded. His voice had lost its cold confidence and now carried a tremor of uncertainty. The hegemony has cataloged every weapon in the galaxy. We have studied every species and every civilization. This is impossible. Kale looked at the towering alien commander and spoke his first word in 12 years. Human. His voice came out rough and harsh from years of disuse, but it carried across the silent chamber like a blade cutting through cloth. I built it from your scraps. Kale continued. From the pieces of civilizations you destroyed and threw away. You never thought to wonder what a primitive species might see in your garbage. He turned the sphere slowly in his hand, letting the light catch its impossible angles. The geometric patterns danced and shifted, hypnotic and terrifying. I found something you missed. Kale said, something hidden in the mathematics that older species were too proud to discover. You all believed you knew everything. You believed there was nothing left to learn, but you were wrong. The Vryn High Commander tried to regain his composure. He straightened his massive body and attempted to look intimidating once more. One weapon cannot defeat the hegemony. He declared, my fleet carries enough firepower to destroy 100 worlds. Whatever trick you have performed here means nothing against such overwhelming force. Kale smiled. It was a small smile, quiet and calm, the smile of someone who knew a secret that no one else understood. I was hoping you would say something like that. He said. He raised the paradox engine and twisted it slightly. The sphere pulsed once with a light that was not quite lighting. That moment, every weapon on every Vrin ship in the entire system went completely dark. The soldiers in the council chamber felt their weapons go cold and dead in their hands. The warships hanging in space around the station suddenly lost all offensive capability. 300 vessels armed with enough firepower to crack planets were now as harmless as children's toys. The High Commander looked down at the dead weapon in his guard's hands. He looked up at the small human holding the impossible sphere. His face showed pure terror now. The terror of a predator suddenly realizing it had become prey. How? He whispered. The Vrin had conquered the galaxy for thousands of years. They had crushed every enemy who stood before them. They had never faced a threat they could not destroy until now. You made a mistake. Kale said, all of you made the same mistake. You looked at humanity and saw a young species barely crawling among the stars. You saw primitives playing with technology we barely understood. You never once considered that being young might be an advantage. The ancient species had grown set in their ways over millions of years. They believed they knew all the rules of the universe. They stopped questioning and wondering and imagining new possibilities. But humans had not forgotten how to wonder. Humans still ask questions that older species thought were foolish. What if the rules are wrong? What if there is something more? What if the impossible is actually possible? Kale had spent 12 years asking those questions. He had studied the abandoned research of dead civilizations. He had found the gaps and errors that ancient scientists had overlooked. And in those gaps, he had built something that should not exist, a weapon that changed the rules of reality itself. The council members were staring at Kale with expressions of shock and dawning hope. Councilor Morix was already calculating how he might use this situation to his advantage. The Velith delegate had stopped weeping and was watching the human with new eyes. The Dracori delegate was nodding slowly as understanding crept across his scaled face. Only the Vrin looked afraid. Only the conquerors realized what this moment truly meant. Their power had always rested on one simple truth. They had the biggest weapons and the strongest ships, but now a single human mechanic had made all of that strength meaningless. What do you want? The High Commander asked. His voice was barely a whisper now. Kale looked at him for a long moment. He thought about all the species the Vrin had destroyed. He thought about all the civilizations they had crushed and forgotten. He thought about what they would have done to humanity if he had not been here. Then he spoke again. I want you to surrender. The conquerors kneel. The Vrin High Commander stood frozen in the council chamber. Every eye watched him as he processed what had just happened. His fleet was powerless. His soldiers were unarmed. A single human held a device that could apparently rewrite the rules of reality itself. For thousands of years, the Vrin had been the ones who made demands. They had been the ones who decided who would live and who would die. They had never bowed to anyone. They had never surrendered to anyone. Now, a small creature from a species they had considered barely worth noticing was telling them to give up. The High Commander's living armor writhed and shifted as emotions battled within him. Pride demanded that he refuse. Pride demanded that he die fighting rather than submit to this humiliation. But survival was a stronger instinct than pride. He had seen what the sphere could do. He had watched his guards scattered across time and space like leaves in a wind. He had felt his weapons go dead without any warning. If this human decided to use the device against the fleet itself, there would be nothing left of the Vrin hegemony. Nothing at all. The High Commander slowly lowered himself to his knees. His living armor went still and turned from its usual dark color to a pale gray. This was a sign of absolute surrender that had not been seen among the Vryn for 10,000 years. It was hardwired into their biology from ancient times, when they had been prey instead of predators. When faced with a threat that could destroy them completely, they would submit totally in hopes of being spared. Every other Vryn in the chamber followed their commander's example. They dropped to their knees, and their armor turned gray. Name your terms, the High Commander said in a broken voice. The council members watched this scene with amazement written on their faces. Just minutes ago, they had been groveling before the Vryn, offering everything they had to avoid destruction. Now the situation had completely reversed. The mightiest empire in the galaxy was kneeling before a silent mechanic from Salvage Bay 7 counselor. Morax was the first of the aliens to recover his wits. His many eyes narrowed as he began to calculate how he could benefit from this incredible turn of events. He pushed himself up from his own kneeling position and stepped toward Kale. This is a great victory, Morax said in his oily voice. Surely we should discuss how to divide the spoils among the council species. Vryn have vast territories and resources that could be shared by those who have been there. Victim's Kale turned to look at the fat Cathray. Counselor, he remembered all the times Morax had walked past Salvage Bay 7 without even glancing at the workers inside. He remembered how Morax had profited from the improved output while never once acknowledging who was responsible. He remembered how Morax had been on his knees offering his own people as slaves just minutes ago now. This same creature was trying to claim a share of a victory he had done nothing to achieve. I am not Earth's representative, Kale said quietly. I am just a mechanic, but I am the mechanic with the weapon that can end your civilization in a heartbeat. He looked directly into Morax's many eyes. Sit down, Kale said. Morax sat down immediately. His fat body hit the floor with a heavy thump and he did not dare to move or speak again. Kale turned back to the kneeling Vryn commander. Here are my terms, Kale said. His voice was calm and steady, the voice of someone who had thought about this moment for a very long time. The Vryn hegemony will withdraw from all conquered territories. Every species you have subjugated will be granted their independence. Immediately, you will provide resources to help those species rebuild what you have destroyed. High Commander bowed his head lower. It will be done, he said. Kale continued. Your fleet will be reduced to defensive capacity only. You will have enough ships to protect your own worlds, but not enough to threaten anyone else. Any attempt to rebuild your offensive capability will be met with immediate response. The High Commander nodded. It will be done, he repeated. Finally, Kale said, you will release all records of the species you have destroyed. Their histories and their cultures and their knowledge will be preserved and shared with the galaxy. They may be gone, but they will not be forgotten. This final demand seemed to hit the High Commander harder than the others. The Vryn had always erased the civilizations they conquered. They had taken pride in leaving nothing behind. No memory that their victims had ever existed. Being forced to restore those memories was perhaps the greatest humiliation of all, but he had no choice. It will be done, he said for the third time. Kale lowered the paradox engine and held it loosely. At his side, the crisis was over. The immediate threat had been defeated, but he could feel the eyes of every being in the chamber watching him, could feel them wondering what would happen next. The Vryn had surrendered, but that was only the beginning. The power structure of the entire galaxy had just been shattered. Someone would need to pick up the pieces. Counselor, Morax slowly raised one of his hands. If I may speak, he said carefully. Kale nodded. Morax cleared his throat. What you have done here is remarkable, the counselor said, but we must consider the practical matters. Who will enforce these terms? Who will ensure the Vryn keep their promises? Who will maintain order while the conquered species establish their independence? These were fair questions, even if Morax was asking them for selfish reasons. The Galaxy could not simply return to the way it was before. The Vryn had been a terrible force, but they had also been a stabilizing force. Without them, there would be chaos wars, would break out over territories and resources. The newly freed species might turn on each other. Council members who had been so eager to surrender might try to grab power for themselves. Someone needed to take charge. Someone needed to keep the peace. Every alien in the chamber was looking at Kale. He could see what they were thinking. They feared him because of what his weapon could do, but they also respected him because of what he had chosen not to do. He could have used the Paradox engine to destroy the Ring completely. He could have used it to make himself a conqueror, just like them. Instead, he had demanded justice and freedom for the oppressed. He had shown mercy to his enemies. He had thought about others instead of just himself. That kind of restraint was rare in the galaxy. That kind of wisdom was even rarer. The Velith delegate stood up slowly. She was the first to say what all of them were thinking. "We need a leader," she said. "Someone who can hold this power without being corrupted by other." Compound eyes fixed on Kale. "We need you." Other voices joined hers. Dracori delegate rumbled his agreement. Representatives of a dozen other species added their support even. Councilor Morux nodded reluctantly. Only the Vryn remained silent. Still kneeling in their gray armor of surrender, Kale looked at all of them and felt the weight of the moment pressing down on his shoulders. This was not what he had wanted. He had built the Paradox engine to protect humanity, not to rule the galaxy. But he could see that refusing would cause more harm than accepting. If he walked away now, the power vacuum would tear the galaxy apart. He took a deep breath. "Very well," he said. "I will do what needs to be done." And so the silent mechanic from Salvage Bay 7 became the most powerful being in the galaxy. The reluctant emperor, they called him the Silent Emperor. The name spread across the galaxy like fire across dry grass. Within days, every civilized world knew the story of the human mechanic who had defeated the Vryn hegemony with a weapon built from their own garbage. Within weeks, delegations from every major power were traveling to Nexus Station to pledge their loyalty to this new ruler. Kale watched all of this happening with a mixture of wonder and exhaustion. He had never wanted power. He had never dreamed of sitting on any kind of throne. All he had ever wanted was to protect his people from the dangers of a galaxy that did not respect them. Now he found himself responsible for trillions of beings across thousands of worlds. The Vryn kept their promises because they had no choice. Their fleet withdrew from conquered territories. Resources flowed to species that had been oppressed for generations. Records of destroyed civilizations were released to public archives for the first time in thousands of years. The victims of the hegemony could learn about those who had come before them. The newly freed species celebrated their independence with joy that had been building for centuries. But just as Kale had feared, problems quickly followed the celebrations. Ancient grudges between species flared into conflicts. Border disputes that had been frozen under Vryn rule suddenly became violent. Some of the freed peoples wanted revenge against their former oppressors. Others wanted to become oppressors themselves. Kale found himself working constantly to prevent these conflicts from spiraling out of control. He traveled from world to world, meeting with leaders and listening to grievances. He used the threat of the Paradox engine sparingly, preferring to solve problems through negotiation whenever possible. But everyone knew the weapon existed. Everyone knew that the Silent Emperor could end any conflict instantly if he chose to. That knowledge was often enough to bring stubborn leaders to the bargaining table. The other humans in the galaxy watched Kale's rise with complicated feelings. Some were proud that a human had achieved such power. They saw it as proof that their young species truly belonged among the stars. Others were worried about what would happen when Kale was gone. The Paradox engine was his creation and his alum. Nobody else understood how it worked. Nobody else could build another one. What would happen to humanity when the Silent Emperor died? Kale thought about this question often. He knew he would not live forever. He knew that the piece he was building depended too much on his personal power, so he began working on solutions that would outlast him. He established councils that brought together species from across the galaxy, created laws that protected the rights of all beings, not just the powerful ones. He shared knowledge freely so that no single species could dominate the others. He worked to build institutions that could maintain peace without needing a weapon that rewrote reality. And in his private moments, in the workshop he had never abandoned despite his new responsibilities, Kale continued to tinker and experiment. The paradox engine had been just the beginning. There were other secrets hidden in the gaps between what the galaxy knew and what was truly possible. The ancient species had grown so confident in their understanding that they had stopped looking for new truths. They had built their civilizations on foundations. They never thought to question. Kale questioned everything. He poked and prodded at the edges of known science. He read the research of dead civilizations. With fresh eyes, he asked questions that the old empires had decided were not worth asking. And slowly, piece by piece, he discovered new possibilities, energy sources that could power worlds without pollution, medical technologies that could extend healthy life for centuries, communication systems that could connect minds across vast distances. He shared these discoveries freely with the galaxy, refused to keep them secret or use them for his own advantage. Some of his advisors thought this was foolish. They argued that he should hold on to these advantages to maintain his power. But Kale knew that true power did not come from keeping others weak. True power came from lifting everyone up together. Years passed and the galaxy slowly transformed. The old ways of conquest and domination faded as new possibilities emerged. Species that had been enemies for millennia learned to work together. Problems that had seemed impossible were solved through cooperation. Kale grew older, but he never stopped working. He never stopped learning. He never stopped wondering what else might be possible. When young humans came to him asking how they could help build the future, he always gave them the same advice: stay curious. He would tell them, question everything, especially the things that everyone agrees are true. Remember that being young means you can see possibilities that old eyes have forgotten how to see. The universe is not a puzzle to be solved. It is a workshop waiting for hands brave enough to build something new. This became known as the Emperor's teaching, and it spread across human worlds. Like a guiding light, human children grew up learning to question and wonder and imagine. Human scientists pushed the boundaries of what was known. Human artists created works that expressed ideas no one had thought of before. Other species watched humanity's explosive creativity with amazement and sometimes fear. How could such a young species produce so many new ideas? How could they keep finding solutions to problems that had stumped ancient civilizations? The answer was simple. Humans had not yet learned that certain things were supposed to be impossible. They had not yet built the mental walls that older species had constructed over millions of years. They still believed that tomorrow could be different from today. They still believed that a single person could change everything. Kale Voss had proven that belief was true. As a silent mechanic working alone in a salvage bay had reshaped the destiny of the galaxy, not through violence or cruelty or domination, but through patience and creativity and the courage to ask questions that no one else was asking. In the end, that was the true lesson of the silent emperor. Power was not about controlling others. Power was about seeing possibilities that others had missed, and humanity, young as they were, had only just begun to see what was possible. The galaxy would never be the same, and that was exactly as it should be. The end.